This lecture is about the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19 and a little bit about SARS and coronaviruses in general. I want to start though by talking about global pandemics. And I've touched on this in another video, but a pandemic is a worldwide or global epidemic. And obviously throughout human history, there have been other pandemics. The current one is the COVID-19 pandemic. But I just want to show you that COVID-19 ranks in the top 5 all-time pandemics in terms of the number of people who have been infected and the number of people who have died. And I think that's pretty significant. If you look at this first one, the Black Death caused by the bubonic plague in 1346 to 1353, that killed around 60% of the population of Europe. That was a big deal then. Viruses couldn't spread as easily. Bacteria couldn't spread as easily. The plague was actually caused by bacteria. And now we obviously have treatment for that, but back then people didn't get on airplanes and they weren't as densely populated. So for it to have traveled among the human population enough to kill that many people was a big deal. 1918 flu pandemic called the Spanish flu on this chart killed upwards of 100 million people, which was a big percentage of the population at that time. This was a flu virus. And you and I are sitting here today because our direct ancestors reproduced before they died from either the 1918 flu or the bubonic plague, because that's how many people died from it. We're here today because our direct ancestors didn't. I mean, that's pretty significant to think about. Another bubonic plague in the 500s that ranks number 3, and then number 4 is HIV. I do have a separate lecture video on HIV, but it's really important to realize it is still a global pandemic of huge proportions, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. We don't have, real data on any of these pandemics. Even with COVID-19, we don't know really how many people have died, but it's guessed that at least 36.3 million people as of 2020 had died from HIV. That's a huge number. And then our current pandemic, COVID-19, as of today, which is May 6, 2022, at least 6.3 million people have died worldwide. And it could be as high as 25 million or more, because we just don't have data from certain parts of the world where they don't want to accurately report the data and be judged on how they're managing the pandemic, and certain parts of the world where that data is just not collected. Viruses can definitely spread easier today than other times in history. Our population sizes are larger and our population density is larger. Density is how closely people live to each other in that population. It's different from overall population size. Also, we just have the ability to move around the globe more easily. Someone could get on an airplane who's infected and fly to another country, and before long, thousands of people can be infected just from that one original person. Coronaviruses are viruses that infect the respiratory system and cause illness in humans. They can originate in animals and be passed to humans. A couple of big ones in our history: in 2002, SARS was a big deal, had about a 14% death rate overall, but 50% of people over 64 died from this. It was in Asia and it originated most likely in bats. MERS stands for Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, and this had a very high death rate. Fortunately, it didn't spread very far. There were some cases in the United States. Only about 880 people total died from this, but it was a very big concern because here we are now with another coronavirus. The COVID-19 death rate right now globally combined is 3.4%. Obviously, there are some parts of the world where it's higher, but the total number of cases in the United States and the total number of deaths in the United States is higher than anywhere else in the world, and much higher than the flu. A lot of people say, oh, it's just like the flu. People die from the flu. The flu has less than a 1% death rate. It's not a coronavirus. but I think it's important to point that out, that it's not the same as the flu. And we'll go over other reasons today why it's not the same as the flu. The name of the virus that causes COVID-19 is SARS-CoV-2, and that stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus. So SARS is a coronavirus, and it's the second major one that we know of in this group. So that's why it's SARS-CoV-2. And COVID-19 stands for Coronavirus Disease 2019, which is when we suspect that this first started in Wuhan, China. It's probably earlier than December 2019, but nevertheless, by March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization had declared it a global pandemic. That is a very quick spread of a virus around the world. Very quick. Zoonosis, if you remember this term, is a virus or bacteria that originates in, sorry, I'm trying to highlight this, it's not letting me. Zoonosis, I'm trying to highlight. This is a virus or bacteria or other pathogen that starts in other animals and spreads to humans. Humans are obviously animals too. So we have similar receptors to other animals, and sometimes viruses can mutate to the point where they fit our receptors. It's assumed that COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, originated in bats or pangolins, or maybe bats gave it to pangolins, and then these pangolins were in the marketplace, and these are eaten in parts of China. So they're in the markets alive, and people buy them to eat. And it's suspected that that's where they came from. There are other theories about the virus originating from a lab in Wuhan, China, where we know that people were infected very early on. Some people have suspected that maybe the lab was working on the virus and it accidentally escaped. Others have claimed that it might be intentional, that they were working on biological warfare. None of that is substantiated as far as we know right now. It was zoonotic, meaning it started in other animals and spread to humans. It's called a coronavirus because of these spikes on the surface. These are spike proteins that they use to infect a host cell, and it makes them look somewhat like a crown. Corona means crown. You can see this computer animation image that makes that a little more evident. This is called an electron micrograph. It's from an electron microscope. These viral particles are at least 1/100th the size of our cells. So they're very, very tiny. You cannot see them under a light microscope, such as the little microscope that you brought home in your lab kits, or one that you might have in a classroom at school. You have to use an electron microscope to see these. It is an RNA virus. So if you've watched the virus videos, you know that viruses can have DNA as their genome, or they can have RNA as their genome. And these have RNA as their genome, so they're called retroviruses. Remember, retrovirus just means, retro means backwards. And living organisms are defined by having DNA as their genome. Viruses are unique in that some have RNA as their genome. What's significant about these RNA viruses is they normally have a pretty small genome, meaning that, usually somewhere around 6-8 genes total on their genome. But the SARS-CoV-2 viruses actually have a pretty robust genome. It's bigger than most RNA viruses, more genes on that RNA. The SARS-CoV-2 structure is also important to note that they're what's called an enveloped virus, which might sound like they're more protected, but it actually means they're more fragile. So they don't live on surfaces as long as some other viruses might. They're prone to destruction by UV radiation and heat. So that's why in the summertime, the rates of infection can kind of go down a little bit, but that's sometimes balanced by the fact that people are more active outside doing things. Now, outdoors obviously safer than indoors, but more social gatherings and more in close proximity to each other, maybe than in the winter. People go on airplanes more, they go on cruise ships more, those kinds of things, concerts, festivals, where all viruses can be spread more easily. The spike proteins on the surface of this virus are hugely significant because that's how they infect host cells. So the spike proteins are the key that opens the lock that gets them into the cell. Remember, the lock are those receptors on the surface of a cell. Cells have receptors for molecules to bind, and they have a very specific shape. If a molecule binds to a receptor, that cell knows, let that in. And so these viruses are tricking the host cell by having a spike protein that perfectly fits into the host cell receptor. And now the host cell is going to allow entry of that virus. And that virus is going to hijack that cell and use it as a replication factory, using the enzymes of the cell that it lacks, using the ribosomes and other equipment in the cell to reproduce that the virus can't do on its own. Variants are arising in the SARS-CoV-2 virus, just like in all viruses, and especially RNA viruses have a really high rate of mutation compared to DNA viruses. DNA viruses have a type of proofreading system to check for mistakes. RNA viruses do not. So in general, these have a higher rate of mutation. It's thought actually that these SARS viruses actually have a lower rate of mutation than most RNA viruses. The problem, though, with this particular coronavirus is it has been allowed to replicate in millions of people, and that went on pretty much unchecked for quite a while before more people started getting vaccinated. So now we have a virus that has been enormously successful, and it's replicated, bazillions of times, and it's had the opportunity to mutate. Now, just like all mutations, some of these mutations don't do anything for the virus. Some are actually detrimental to the virus, but some make the virus more successful. And that's where we're at right now. As of today, May 6, 2022, these are the 3 variants that are kind of spiking around the world. The one in the United States right now is this one. Look at that, my highlighter finally worked. And it's thought that these particular mutations that are happening right now are allowing the virus to bind more tightly to our cells. In other words, it's a better fit into the lock. That key fits the lock better. I think we've all gone, to the Home Depot and had a key made. We get home and you put it in your lock and you're like, you have to hold it at just the right spot to even get it to open your door. And then you have another key that you can put in and it just opens the door with no problem. It works better. And that's what happens sometimes with these mutations is some mutations benefit the virus and allow it to have a more tight fit, which means it's more infectious, can infect cells more readily. And they're also thinking it might increase cell-to-cell transmission as well, meaning once the body's infected, that virus can move cell to cell more easily. And that is a very good thing for the virus and a very bad thing for us. How is this virus transmitted? It's transmitted primarily through respiratory droplets that leave the infected person. And it can be just from breathing. You've all gone outside on a cold day when you can see your breath. That's the moisture, the droplets of moisture coming out of your body. And if you have an infection, you're breathing out that infection. So the person doesn't have to be coughing or talking, but coughing and talking and singing obviously project saliva even more. So just depending on what that person's doing, you can catch it just breathing around them if you're really close. If you stay 6 feet or more from that person, then it's thought that even if they're talking at a normal tone, a lot of those droplets are big and they're just going to fall to the ground. Some of them do remain aerosol, meaning they're so small they just remain and float in the air for a period of time, which means you could step into that space and breathe them in. The problem with this virus is some people are most infectious before they show symptoms, and some people are asymptomatic, meaning they never have symptoms, but they're infected and they're out there spreading it to other people. That is a big deal because with most viral infections, you're not contagious until you're showing symptoms. So, hey, you know what? I'm sick. I'm not going to be a jerk and go out and spread this to all my friends. I'm going to stay home. I'm not going to go to work that day and give it to my coworkers. I'm not going to go to school and give it to my classmates. But with the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19, a lot of people are the most infectious before they even know they're sick. Or again, they don't have symptoms at all. So they don't even know they're spreading it to other people. One cough can contain thousands of droplets of liquid, and each of those droplets can contain thousands of viruses. So it's estimated that one infected person can infect on average 2 to 4 other people, but it just depends what they're doing. I mean, if they're in a group setting, you can have one infected person come to a wedding and infect 250 people. So it just depends. Again, those large droplets can fall to surfaces, and then you can pick them up on the surface and transmit to your respiratory tract as well. So how exactly is it infecting our body? Well, those spike proteins on the virus attach to a specific receptor called the ACE2 receptor. So any cell that has this receptor on it is prone to infection. I'm going to show you a diagram in a few minutes that really shows you how widespread these ACE2 receptors are through our body. So many different cells throughout so many of our organs have these receptors, which is why this is far more damaging than the flu virus. Okay, the flu virus can get in and infect your lungs, but it's not going to get into your kidneys, liver, brain, heart, blood vessels. Another tricky thing about this virus is fusion occurs. If you've watched the HIV video, you've seen how fusion occurs in that virus. It's really how some viruses kind of zip together their viral membrane with the host cell membrane. And that's even better than just putting the key in the lock. Okay, so those spike proteins bind to the receptor, and then the two membranes fuse together, really ensuring infection by that virus of the host cell. The initial infection occurs in the nose and throat. Primarily, this kind of upper region of your nose is the favorite place, these epithelial cells and other cells here that have that ACE2 receptor. And then the lower throat here, just above the larynx. Now, when somebody's wearing a mask just over their mouth and the nose is exposed, they're exposing the most vulnerable area to infection. So they're not protecting themselves. It also means if they're infected, they're breathing out particles from the most infected part of their respiratory tract upon initial infection. So after those viruses start replicating here, becoming pretty successful, they're going to travel down into the lungs. And in fact, in particular, the epithelial cells of the air sacs of your lungs, called the alveoli. They can cause these air sacs to collapse and permanently destroy the tissue of those air sacs of the lungs. And so that really limits a person's ability to get oxygen, because that's where the O2 exchange and CO2 exchange is happening in the tiny little capillaries on those air sacs. So that's really important. Also, you can get infected initially through your eyes. It's important to realize that you have this connection between your eyes and your nose called the nasolacrimal duct. And you can see from your tear duct here, there's a tract that gets it to your nose. So there is an ocular route for infection initially from this virus. Once it gets into your lungs, it can spread to your blood vessels, into your blood, into your vascular system, and travel throughout the body and start damaging all kinds of organs that have the ACE2 receptors. So that includes a lot of different areas that I'm going to show you in a minute. Just a little more information here. I already said this part. The infected droplets enter the nose or the mouth and infect the cells. That can also be through the eyes. And it's all those cells that have these ACE2 receptors. The viral particles replicate and move to the lungs. And then they move through the bloodstream to the kidneys, intestines, liver, the lining of the blood vessels. This is why people are getting blood clots, the heart, the testes. I'm going to show you an image in a minute that's even more organs than that. This is a big deal too. This virus can cause a cytokine storm, which is an exaggerated immune response that can result in failure of multiple organ systems in your body and even death. You know, a lot of people have this overreaction of the immune system when they get a viral infection, and that's what can kill you. It's not really the virus itself that releases a toxin that kills you. It's your immune system's response to that virus that kills you. And in this case, this virus can infect so many different organs in your body that if you have an inflammatory response where these chemical messengers are released by your white blood cells so they can communicate with each other. Those are what the cytokines are, if you remember the immune system video. And that can cause this huge inflammatory response that can really damage different systems in your body and cause death. Those ACE2 receptors are so widespread throughout your body. So that's the terrible, terrible thing about this virus. Your brain, your eyes, your nasal cavity, your oral cavity, your thyroid, heart and blood vessels, lungs, liver, gallbladder, kidneys, urinary bladder, stomach, pancreas, intestines, female and male reproductive systems, and certain layers of your skin. So hardly any area of your body is exempt from infection. I wouldn't ask you a complete list, but you just need to understand as a person on this planet right now that this virus is very damaging in some people, especially people who are unvaccinated. This is not the same as the common cold. This is not a flu virus. These are different ways that you can become infected, not just with direct contact through breathing, but through exposure to respiratory droplets. This oral fecal route is a big deal. So we know now that infectious viral particles are present in feces of infected people. And so people who don't wash their hands can touch a surface, and then you could pick that up and infect your eyes, nose, mouth if you touch your face. But it's also how we're tracking infection rates right now. UCSD in particular is tracking infection rates in San Diego County by testing the wastewater stream, going to the sewage plant, testing the sewage and finding out how prevalent that virus is in the wastewater stream. So that's pretty crazy. Infected blood or other bodily fluids touching contaminated surfaces is not the major way that people catch COVID, but it is possible. This is an enveloped virus, so it doesn't live as long on surfaces as things like the flu virus and some other cold viruses do. Air conditioners can circulate those viral particles. Air conditioners usually have a filter system that helps with that. So this isn't a huge way that it's transmitted. Illness obviously ranges from no symptoms at all to mild illness to severe illness and death. Long COVID is showing up more and more in people, even people who had really mild illness to start with, and they develop these long-term symptoms because, again, this virus is not just infecting the lungs and then goes away. It can damage organs, and those damaged parts might start having issues months or weeks down the line. I personally know of a person who is a year post-COVID, and they are still having severe symptoms, just constant pain in their muscles, really still trouble breathing, heart problems, kidney failure, all that happened weeks after their initial infection when they thought they were all well. So this is not the same as a cold virus, not the same as the flu. Those viruses do not wreak this systemic damage to the body. Lots of comorbidities and underlying conditions that can cause you to be at higher risk of serious illness and death. You can see the list there: high blood pressure, other cardiovascular disease, having a weak immune system, cancer, diabetes, asthma. And pregnant women are more prone to illness. That's why they're urging pregnant women to get vaccinated. There is no possible way for that vaccine to damage the baby in any way. And it protects you from infecting the baby and from you yourself possibly dying. I know several nurses who have had really, really tragic stories of pregnant women dying, even some like at 8 months pregnant. And sometimes they're able to save that baby and sometimes they're not. It's a very, very sad situation. Number one way to reduce transmission is vaccination. Hand washing, don't touch your eyes, nose, mouth, wear a well-fitting mask, that covers your nose, your mouth, and your chin. Not a cloth mask that's loose on your face, but a tight fitting mask. Let's talk about masks for a second. When your surgeon comes in and cuts you open, do they wear a mask? Why do they wear a mask? They're wearing a mask for two reasons: to protect you and to protect themselves. They're mostly doing it to protect you because you're opened up and your skin, which is a major barrier defense, is no longer intact. And they don't want you to die from an infection that they gave to you. Your dentist wears a mask when he's working on your teeth to protect himself because he's in close proximity to you, and to protect you from him. Different parts of the world have been wearing masks for a very, very, very long time in public places and on airplanes to protect them from all sorts of viral and bacterial infections. You can read the scientific literature. Masks prevent transmission of diseases. If you don't believe it, read the scientific data. Please do not trust social media, left-wing media, right-wing media, whatever slant the media has. Everybody has an agenda. Please get your scientific information from a scientific source. The CDC, the NIH, reputable scientific journals such as Nature. Please trust scientific data that follows the scientific method. Don't trust other sources that say masks are baloney, because they're not. This 6-foot distance came about just estimating how far saliva droplets can travel. I don't think 6 feet is far enough to, if you knew somebody had COVID and neither one of you were wearing a mask, would you want to stand within 6 feet of them? I don't want to be much further away than 6 feet. Obviously, we know outdoor events for a couple of reasons: UV radiation, heat, airflow. But if you get a big enough group, that's not going to really protect you. There's a separate lecture about these vaccines. I should have put RNA vaccine next to the Pfizer also. But Moderna right now has a slightly higher success rate in preventing serious illness compared to Pfizer. We all know people who have become infected even though they're vaccinated. But did they die? Chances are no, they did not. Did they become hospitalized? Chances are no, they did not. Chances are if they were vaccinated and they became infected, they had a very mild illness compared to people who were not vaccinated. Pfizer, also extremely effective, and it's also an mRNA vaccine. Just this week, this is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine developed by Janssen. It's been advised that people not get this vaccine anymore. I'm going to draw a big line through it. Don't get this one. They're saying only get it if there are no other vaccine options. It's causing blood clots and it's just not effective. You want this one. If you can get it, your second best choice is this one. And that's just based on current data. And I'll tell you, they're pretty neck and neck. I just want to show you real quickly, and I'll go back to these other slides. Rate of COVID hospitalization. People in the hospital between February and August of 2021, so for a 6-month period of time, 84% of people in the hospital were unvaccinated compared to 4.5 that were vaccinated. That's pretty crazy. That's a hugely significant difference. How about people who died? Look at the difference here. Look at unvaccinated versus vaccinated down here. Vaccinated, look how low the death rate is in comparison. If that's not convincing, then I don't know what is. Yes, you might still catch it, but you're not going to die and you're not going to be in the hospital. You're going to have a very mild illness in comparison for most people who don't have other underlying conditions. Paxlovid is an antiviral drug that's now available. So I know some people are saying, well, why should I get vaccinated? If I catch it, I can just get this antiviral drug. Well, first of all, it's only available after you're infected. So you can still get pretty sick. It's also only available to people at high risk So this is people with cancer or other high risk conditions. That means they could become hospitalized or die. So not everyone can get this. Like if I caught COVID, I couldn't call my doctor and say, I want, give me some of that paxlovid. But this is the good news, 89% reduction in serious illness or death in the patients in the clinical trial. And these were all patients who were at high risk. There are some side effects. You don't want to just take this if you aren't at risk because it doesn't come without side effects. And by the way, you can look up what those side effects are if you're interested. US deaths are currently approaching 1 million people as of today, May 6, 2022. Global deaths at 6.3 million, and the US has the highest number of cases and highest number of deaths. I know I've talked about these mRNA vaccines before, but I just want to emphasize again what happens. It goes into the muscle cells of the arm, and it's a piece of RNA that codes for the spike protein. We start making those spike proteins, and now our cells present those on the surface of the cell as being something foreign, and we produce antibodies in response to that. If you're not sure how that works, you should watch the lecture on the immune system to see how we produce antibodies in response to a foreign particle. We now have antibodies against the spike protein, and that messenger RNA piece that was injected gets broken down very quickly. In fact, one of the problems they had initially developing all types of mRNA vaccines was our cells would break it down before the antibody response occurred. And they needed it to stick around long enough for us to produce a robust number of antibodies. And that was a challenge because the cell wants to just break it down. But eventually the cell just breaks it down and it doesn't exist anymore. It's also important to realize something else I said in the previous videos about this, and that is there's no possible way that mRNA can get into your nucleus and affect your DNA. It is not possible. We can inject mRNA into all of your cells. It doesn't matter what it codes for. It's not going to damage your DNA. It is not possible. First of all, you know now from taking this class that DNA and RNA are made from two completely different nucleotides. They're different sugar, and they're not interchangeable. RNA can't get inserted into DNA, and it also can't damage DNA. It's just not even possible for it to alter your DNA. So think about the science when you hear some of these claims. Sorry, I have to get a sip of water here. Sorry. I'm gonna start coughing just talking about COVID. Also, it's important for you to look at this if you have any questions about how this emergency use authorization for the vaccines came about, this rigorous process that a vaccine goes through. It's not just approved overnight. This is too small to read, and I'm not going to read it to you, but I just want you to know that you can look this up. It's on the FDA website, and it's the steps that a vaccine goes through before it's authorized for emergency use. It's a very rigorous process. It doesn't just happen overnight. The other two slides are the ones I already showed you, showing how significant the difference is between hospitalizations and deaths in unvaccinated people versus vaccinated people. Okay, that's my lecture on coronaviruses. Let me know if you have any questions.